the metallic shriek of a heavy broadsword being dragged from its iron scabbard sliced through the freezing, diseased air of the eastern border checkpoint. "Move," a heavily armored guard barked, slamming his silver-tipped boot against the rusted iron turnstile. The exhausted, shivering queue of unaffiliated wolves violently flinched. "You have exactly 10 seconds to present your transit documentation, or you will be permanently removed from this territory in pieces." 9. 8. In the center of the filthy, freezing mud, a 4-year-old girl named Lyra did not cower. Instead, she looked up with absolute, unhurried attention at the towering, cloaked stranger who had just silently approached the checkpoint perimeter. She stared straight into his glowing amber eyes, eyes that were a flawless, unspeakable genetic mirror of her own, and spoke with terrifying clarity. "Papa, the line is not moving." Behind the tiny girl, a woman in a ragged, threadbare wool coat went entirely, perfect still. If you are new to the pack, do not look away. The most lethal alpha king on the entire continent has just been claimed by a 4-year-old child he never knew existed. And these corrupt border guards are seconds away from making the final mistake of their miserable lives. Stay with May until the very end to witness a king's absolute wrath. And make sure to hit that subscribe button to join Wolf Enigma. 7. 6, the guard sneered, raising the heavy, lethal steel blade directly towards the frozen mother's neck. "Papers right now, or you lose the hand." The woman did not reach into her pockets. She could not even breathe. 6 years of desperate, agonizing planning had just violently collided with the one variable she could never control, her daughter's primordial instincts. And as the guard stepped forward to strike, the towering stranger in the heavy black cloak finally stopped walking. Time did not merely slow down for Ilara, it completely fractured into 1,000 jagged, agonizing shards. Standing in the freezing, ankle-deep mud of the eastern checkpoint, surrounded by the stench of wet wool and festering despair, her entire world ceased to rotate. Her lungs forgot how to draw in the bitter winter air. Her heart, which had beaten with the frantic, terrified rhythm of a hunt-prey animal for 6 agonizing years, simply stopped. For 2,190 relentless days, Ilara had survived by mastering the absolute art of invisibility. Being an unaffiliated wolf in the brutal, sprawling expanse of the Ethelgard Empire was not a life, it was a grueling, slow-motion death sentence. With her pack to offer sanctuary, legal standing, or physical warmth, she had been reduced to a ghost haunting the absolute fringes of society. Ilara had scrubbed the blood-stained, freezing stone floors of provincial slaughterhouses until the skin peeled entirely from her raw, blistered hands. She had hauled heavy iron ore in the suffocating depths of the northern mines, trading her youth and her health for a handful of copper coins and stale, moldy crusts of bread. She had slept in abandoned, rotting barns, wrapping her frail, shivering body around her daughter to shield the child from the lethal winter blizzards that swept across the desolate lowlands. Every sinking dignity, every missed meal, every bruised rib and cracked fingernail had been a calculated, willing sacrifice. She had endured the absolute worst of the world to ensure that the royal court would never find the treasure she was hiding beneath the filthy, oversized hood of a beggar's coat. 6 years ago, Alara had been a quiet, unremarkable scribe in the lower libraries of the capital. She had never sought the attention of the supreme Alpha King. But fate was a cruel, unpredictable architect. And when she discovered she was carrying the direct, undeniable genetic heir to the most powerful bloodline on the continent, she knew exactly what the corrupted royal council would do. They would take the child, mold her into a political weapon, and quiet dispose of the low-ranking mother who dared to taint their pristine hierarchy. So, Alara had fled in the absolute dark of a winter storm, erasing her own existence to keep her daughter breathing. She had taught Lyra the ironclad rules of their miserable survival before the child could even properly walk. Keep your hood pulled down. Never look a uniformed guard in the eyes. Never speak unless spoken to. Shrink into the shadows. Be small. Be silent. Be nothing. Lyra was a brilliant, profoundly observant child. She had obeyed these crushing rules with a quiet, solemn understanding that constantly broke Alara's heart. She never complained about the gnawing hunger in her small belly. She never cried when her patched leather boots let the freezing rain seep through to her toes. But there was one catastrophic variable that Alara could not discipline out of the girl: her ancient, sovereign blood. Hidden beneath the frayed, filthy cuff of Lyra's left sleeve lay a cryptic, complex, geometric rune branded directly into her delicate skin. It was an archaic blood magic seal, purchased from a rogue shadow weaver in the slums for the price of 10 years of Alara's own lifespan. The seal was specifically designed to suppress the overwhelming, dominant alpha resonance that radiated from the child's soul, masking her royal scent from the world. For 4 years, the intricate lines of the mark had burned as dark as forged iron. But magic fueled by a dying mother's vitality was never permanent. In the last 3 weeks, the dark iron lines of the rune had begun to fade into a pale, ghostly silver. The structural integrity of the suppression spell was collapsing. The raw, primordial instincts of an apex predator were finally beginning to bleed through the magical containment. Alara had known they were running out of time. She had dragged them to this border checkpoint in a desperate, final attempt to cross into the neutral territories before the seal broke completely. She had been too late. The fading of the mark had allowed the ancient, cellular recognition to awaken the very second the towering stranger stepped into the perimeter. Lyra had not just looked at a man. Her unleashed instincts had locked onto the exact biological origin of her own soul. Now, the absolute worst nightmare Alara had ever conceived was unfolding in the freezing mud. Her daughter's hood had fallen back, exposing the undeniable, brilliant amber eyes of the royal bloodline to the harsh morning light. And the child had spoken the one word that could shatter empires. 7. 6. The corrupt checkpoint guard snarled, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic genetic collision happening right in front of him. He tightened his thick leather gloves, raising the heavy steel broadsword higher. The cruel, sadistic anticipation in his eyes was sickeningly clear. He enjoyed the power he wielded over the starving and the broken. Papers right now. Vermin. Or I will take the child's hand instead of yours. 5. Alara slowly turned her head, her breath crystallizing in the freezing air. She looked past the lethal edge of the descending blade. She looked past the terrified, cowering crowd of unaffiliated wolves. She looked directly at the massive, shadowed figure standing completely motionless at the edge of the checkpoint. She did not reach for her transit papers. She simply closed her eyes, wrapping her scarred, trembling arms round her daughter's small shoulders, preparing to absorb the agonizing impact of the steel blade with her own spine. Alpha King Torin of Ethelgard did not travel to the eastern lowlands to find salvation. He had come looking for the rot. For 3 years, he had sat upon a velvet throne in a gilded palace, listening to the polished, synchronized lies of his royal counselors. He had grown suffocated by the endless political theater, the hollow reassurances that his empire was prosperous and just. So, he had left the capital. The inspection of the border checkpoints was entirely unannounced. He wore no crown. He carried no royal banners. He was wrapped in a heavy, unremarkable black traveling cloak, completely suppressing the suffocating, dominant alpha aura that usually forced entire rooms to their knees. He was merely an anonymous shadow observing the brutal, unchecked corruption of his own border patrols. He had stood silently in the freezing mud for 20 minutes, watching the guards extort the weak. He had watched Commander Vane's men systematically humiliate the unaffiliated wolves, treating them like diseased cattle. Torin was mentally preparing the execution warrants for every single soldier stationed at this checkpoint. Then, the freezing eastern wind suddenly changed direction. It swept across the muddy, overcrowded processing square, cutting directly through the overwhelmed stench of rusted iron, wet wool, and human misery. It brought something entirely different to the Alpha King. It brought a scent that did not belong in this desolate wasteland. It was the pristine fragrance of crisp, untouched winter snow and the deep, intoxicating sweetness of night, blooming hyacinth. The physiological reaction within Torin was not a subtle awakening. It was a violent, catastrophic molecular detonation. An electrical shock of pure, unadulterated primal magic ripped down his spinal column with the force of a lightning strike. It seized his nervous system, paralyzing his lungs and fusing his soul to a frequency he had never encountered in his 32 years of existence. The blood roaring in his ears became deafening. Deep within the cavernous, heavily muscled expanse of his chest, a terrifying sound was born. It was not a human sound. It was a low, guttural, earth-shattering purr that vibrated through his ribs and resonated through the soles of his heavy boots, a primordial frequency demanding absolute, unconditional possession. His inner wolf, a beast of legendary military discipline and terrifying lethality, slammed against the titanium cage of his mind, instantly override his conscious thought. The beast howled a single, deafening, undeniable truth that echoed through his marrow: mate. Torin stopped breathing. He slowly turned his massive head. The golden amber of his eyes, usually cold and calculating, began to flare with a blinding, radioactive tensity beneath the shadow of his hood. He tracked the intoxicating scent through the freezing air, his supernatural vision cutting through the falling snow and the dense, terrified crowd. His glowing eyes locked onto the fragile, shivering silhouette of the woman in the threadbare coat. She had her back to him, wrapping her frail body over a small child, preparing to take a sword strike intended for a beggar. But to Torin's fully awakened predatory senses, she was the absolute center of the universe. She was the gravity holding his world together. A desperate, agonizing need crashed over the Alpha King. He felt an overwhelming compulsion to cross the mud, to wrap his massive cloak around her shivering shoulders, to pull her into his chest and slaughter anyone who dared to even look at her. But before he could move, before he could process the cataclysmic reality that his fated equal was starving in the mud of his own kingdom, the child in the woman's arms looked directly at him. The little girl did not look at him with the fear of a peasant observing a predator. She looked at him with the absolute, inherent authority of a royal heir, claiming what rightfully belonged to her. Papa. The line is not moving. The word struck the Alpha King harder than any physical weapon ever forged in the history of the world. Torin stared in the child's face. He saw the dark, unruly hair blowing in the bitter wind. He saw the proud, stubborn tilt of her small chin. And then he looked deeply into her eyes. They were not just brown or hazel. They were a brilliant, luminous amber, rimmed with a distinct, glowing ring of pure gold. It was the absolute, undeniable genetic signature of the Ethelgard bloodline. For 10 generations, those exact eyes had looked down from the high throne. They were entirely impossible to fake, impossible to dilute, and impossible to mistake. The universe did not merely stop. It completely collapsed. Torin was not just a powerful wolf. He was a military commander who understood the fundamental architecture of genetics and lineage. The realization was a sudden, apocalyptic earthquake shattering his reality. He had a daughter. He had a living, breathing child. For 4 years, a piece of his own soul had been walking the earth in abject poverty, wearing patched leather boots and hiding from the very soldiers who were sworn to protect her. He looked back at the woman shielding the girl, the mother, his mate. She had known. She had been running. She had been hiding his heir in the shadows, enduring unimaginable suffering, likely because she knew exactly what the corrupt royal council would do to a low-ranking mother of a royal child. She had sacrificed her entire existence to keep his daughter safe from his own empire. The euphoric, intoxicating warmth of the newly awakened mate bond was instant incinerated. In its place, a cold, apocalyptic dread took root, followed immediately by an anger so massive, so profound, that it threatened to permanently fracture the Alpha King's sanity. 5, the corrupt guard snarled, entirely blind to the god of war waking up 10 feet away. The guard adjusted his grip on the heavy broadsword, his muscles flexing as he prepared to bring the lethal steel down upon the mother's fragile spine. Your time is up. Filth. Torin did not scream. He did not shout a command to halt. He did not even reach for the heavy weapons strapped beneath his cloak. The true, ending terror of the Ethelgard king was never loud. The atmospheric pressure in the checkpoints simply plummeted to absolute zero. The air became suffocatingly heavy, saturated with a killing intent so pure and absolute that the falling snowflakes suspended perfect still in mid-air. The Alpha King was no longer observing a border inspection. He was witnessing a direct physical threat against his fated mate and his royal heir. And the punishment for that transgression was complete, unmitigated eradication. The heavy steel broadsword descended with lethal velocity. It aimed directly for the center of Elara's fragile, exposed spine. It never connected. A localized, kinetic shockwave violently intercepted the blade a fraction of an inch above her threadbare coat. The enchanted steel did not merely stop. It catastrophically detonated. The deafening crack of shattering metal echoed across the frozen lowlands like a thunderbolt. Jagged shards of the blade exploded outward, embed them harmlessly into the wooden barricades. The corrupt guard was violently thrown backward. He slammed in the iron turnstile, his arms completely shattered by the massive reverberating force of the impact. The eastern checkpoint fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Elara slowly opened her eyes. She was still breathing. She checked Lyra. The child was completely unharmed, her amber eyes still fixed with calm curiosity on the towering stranger in the black cloak. The heavy oak door of the command post violently kicked open. Commander Vane marched out into the freezing mud. He was a man built of arrogant cruelty and political corruption. He wore a pristine uniform of dark leather and thick, expensive furs, completely untouched by the misery of the checkpoint he governed. In his right hand, he carried his signature weapon, a heavy, braided leather whip tightly woven with razor-sharp silver wire, specifically designed to burn and severely mutilate shifter flesh. Vane assessed the scene with venomous disgust. He saw his guard writhing in the mud. He saw the shattered sword. He looked at Elara, kneeling in the filth with her child. He completely ignored the motionless, cloaked figure standing at the perimeter. Vane operated on the fatal assumption that he was the apex predator in the territory. "What is this absolute treason?" Vane roared, his voice dripping with sadistic authority. He marched toward Elara, his heavy boots splashing the freezing mud against her skirt. "You dare use cheap, illegal hedge witch magic at my checkpoint. You dare damage Imperial property and defy a direct transit order." Elara pulled Lyra tighter against her chest, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She recognized Commander Vane. Every unaffiliated wolf knew his name. He was a monster who collected bribes in exchange for lives. Vane uncoiled the silver whip. The metal hissed maliciously in the damp air. "You unregistered parasites think you can bypass the toll with parlor tricks," Vane sneered, standing directly over them. He looked down at Lyra. He did not notice her eyes. He only saw a target. He only saw leverage. The mother pays the toll, but the child pays for the insolence. I will flay the skin from her back to remind this entire line exactly who commands this border. Vane raised the silver whip high in the falling snow. The world snapped. Reality tore wide open. Torin moved. He did not step. He did not walk. He simply ceased to exist in his previous location. The laws of physics shattered. They violently bent around his massive, heavily muscled frame. In a single, imperceptible microsecond, the Alpha King materialized directly between Commander Vane and the kneeling mother. The heavy black traveling cloak slipped from Tori's broad shoulders. It dropped heavily into the mud. The Alpha King was revealed. He wore the royal battle armor of the Ethelgard Empire. Solid obsidian steel. Intricate gold filigree. The ancient, terrifying crest of the supreme sovereign carved directly into the breastplate. Vayne swung the whip with all his sadistic strength. Thorin did not even look at the incoming weapon. He raised his bare left hand. He caught the braided silver leather effortlessly mid-air. The lethal silver, forged specifically to burn werewolf flesh, hissed violently against his broad palm. A thick plume of acrid smoke rose into the air. Thorin did not flinch. He did not blink. He simply squeezed his fist. The enchanted weapon disintegrated. The metal groaned in agony. It fractured into 1,000 microscopic pieces. It pulverized into fine, glittering dust that drifted harmlessly away in the bitter winter wind. Vayne gasped. The breath was violently stolen from his lungs. His arrogant, venomous smile vanished. The political confidence that had shielded him for a decade morphed instantly into primal, suffocating terror. He looked at the massive hand that had just crushed solid silver. He looked up at the towering, indestructible titan standing before him. He looked into the blinding, radioactive amber eyes of his king. "My king," Vayne whispered. His face turned a mottled, desperate ash gray. His eyes bulged with sheer, unadulterated panic. Thorin did not speak. He released his dominant aura. It was not a mere display of territorial dominance. It was an apocalyptic environmental event. The gravity in the checkpoint violently multiplied. The ground shuddered. It shook as if struck by a massive seismic tremor. The heavy, frozen earth beneath their boot spider webbed with deep, jagged fissures. It groaned ominously under the sudden, impossible weight. Every Sing guard in the perimeter collapsed simultaneously. They did not bow out of respect. They were physically driven into the dirt. And visible, crushing atmospheric pressure slammed in them. Heavy iron armor buckled. It dented inward. Bones creaked dangerously. Lungs violently compressed. The corrupt soldiers of the checkpoint lay flattened against the freezing mud. They were completely paralyzed. They gasped desperate for air that suddenly felt as thick and heavy as liquid lead. The wooden watchtowers groaned and splintered. The iron turnstiles warped and bent into useless, twisted shapes. The falling snow stopped in midair, suspended in the localized gravity field of a sovereign god of war. Only Commander Vayne remained standing. But he was not standing by choice. He was locked in place. He was suspended in a localized, supernatural stasis that entirely paralyzed his motor functions. Thorin slowly turned his head. His eyes were no longer eyes. They were dying stars. They radiated a lethal energy that incinerated the surrounding shadows. "You raise silver," Thorin said. His voice was demonic. It was a terrifying, layered, overlapping frequency. The voice of a sovereign man. The roar of a primordial beast. It vibrated with catastrophic, localized force. "You drew a weapon against my blood." Vayne's eyes rolled wildly in their sockets. He could not move his jaw. He could not beg. He finally looked past Torin's massive legs. He looked at the child sitting in the mud. He saw the amber eyes. He saw the golden ring. The absolute, undeniable genetic signature of the High Throne. The catastrophic, unimaginable magnitude of his error fully registered in his terrified mind. He had just threatened to flay the royal heir. He had just demanded a bribe from the queen. Torin reached out. He did not touch Vane. He simply extended his bare hand, his palm facing the commander's chest. "You are completely eradicated," Torin whispered. The Alpha King closed his fingers into a tight fist. He channeled the sheer, cataclysmic force of his sovereign, supernatural power directly into the commander's chest. It was a spiritual and structural obliteration. The invisible kinetic impact violently ruptured Vane's sacred connection to his inner wolf. The ethereal tether snapped. It sounded like a deafening, psych thunderclap. Vane's physical body convulsed with horrific, cinematic violence. His ribs shattered internally under the localized, crushing gravity of the king's concentrate wrath. His collarbone snapped. The breath was permanently expelled from his crushed lungs. Torin casually lowered his hand. The supernatural stasis broke. Commander Vane dropped heavily into the freezing mud. He fell like a discarded sack of broken stones. He was not dead. Death was a swift, honorable mercy that Torin absolutely refused to grant him. Vane was permanently stripped of his wolf spirit. He was completely paralyzed from the neck down. His internal architecture was pulverized. He was now an empty, shattered vessel. He lay helplessly in the freezing filth he had forced others to wallow in. He choked continuously on his own spectacular, irreversible ruin. The threat was entirely eradicated. The reality-bending wrath had concluded. The Alpha King had permanently reclassified a corrupt tyrant into cautionary tale of absolute destruction. The heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the eastern border checkpoint was more terrifying than the supernatural violence that had preceded it. The falling snow, which had been perfectly suspended in mid-air by the sheer, catastrophic force of the Alpha King's aura, finally began to drift down again. The white flakes dusted the shattered remnants of the iron turnstiles and the paralyzed bodies of the corrupt garrison, covering the ruined checkpoint in a blanket of pristine, freezing quiet. Commander Vane lay twitching in the freezing mud, a broken, wheezing testament to the absolute foolishness of threatening the High Throne. The remaining perimeter guards, still pinned to the frozen earth by the crushing supernatural gravity, did not dare to twitch. They did not dare to breathe loudly. They simply waited for the god of war to turn his radioactive amber eyes upon them and finish the massacre. Torin did not look at them. He kept his broad, armored back to the carnage. "You will transport what remains of your commander to the darkest dungeons of the capital," the Alpha King commanded. His voice was no longer a demonic roar, but the cold, absolute decree of a sovereign judge. "You will surrender yourselves to the High Tribunal for immediate processing. If a single one of you attempts to flee into the neutral territories, I will personally hunt you down and tear the wolf from your souls." The guards whimpered in unison, a pathetic, collective sound of complete and utter submission. Torin dismissed them from his reality entirely. He slow turned around to face the woman and the child. The terrifying, apocalyptic wrath that had just bent the laws of physics vanished completely. The lethal, glowing intensity of his amber eyes softened into a warm, desperate gold. The indestructible apex predator receded, leaving behind a profoundly shattered, isolated man who was looking at his entire universe for the very first time. Torin took a slow, heavy step forward. The freezing mud sucked at his armored boots. He took another step, closing the distance. And then, right in the center of the filthy, blood-stained checkpoint, in full view of the terrified public and his trembling soldiers, the supreme ruler of the Ethelgard Empire dropped heavily to his knees. The heavy thud of his armored kneecaps striking the frozen earth echoed through the silent square. The bitter, freezing mud instant stained his pristine obsidian breastplate and the intricate gold filigree of his royal crest. He did not care. He would have crawled over shattered glass just to breathe the same air as them. Lyra stood perfect still, watching the giant man kneel before her. She was completely unfazed by the catastrophic violence that had just occurred. She looked at the pulverized remnants of the guard's broadsword, and then she looked directly in Torin's face. "You broke it," the 4-year-old girl observed, her voice steady and remarkably factual. Torin's chest heaved. A single, burning tear broke free, carving a clean line through the dust on his chiseled face. "I did," he whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its sovereign command. "I will break every single thing in this world that ever tries to hurt you." He reached out with a hand that was large enough to crush a man's skull. His fingers were trembling violently. He hovered his hand inches away from Lyra's small, freezing cheek, terrified that his sheer size and the cold metal of his armor would frighten her. But the child simply leaned forward and pressed her face into his warm palm with the absolute, unquestioning trust of a daughter claiming her father. A choked, agonizing sob tore through Torin's throat. He gently stroked her dark hair, his thumb brushing against her freezing skin. Then, he looked up at Elara. The mother of his child was still kneeling in the mud, her arms wrapped protectively around hers. She was shaking violently, her wide, exhausted gray eyes completely overwhelmed by the reality of the moment. Torin looked at her threadbare, oversized coat. He looked at her raw, blistered hands, ruined by years of scrubbing stone floors and hauling iron ore. He saw the pale, fading silver lines of the suppression, rune branded into Lyra's wrist, and he instantly understood the horrifying, catastrophic cost Elara had paid to keep their daughter hidden from his enemies. 2,190 days, Torin whispered, his voice thick with a profound, soul-crushing remorse. "You carried my heart in the absolute dark for 6 years. You starved. You froze. You bled. You fought an entire empire in the shadows to protect our blood." Elara stared at the weeping king. For 6 years, she had meticulously trained hers never to cry. Crying was a dangerous vulnerability. But the ancient, thrumming frequency of the mate bond was currently flooding her nervous system with an overwhelming, undeniable sensation of absolute, unconditioned safety. The Alpha King was not looking at her with the cold judgment of a sovereign claiming his property. He was looking at her with a devotion so pure and absolute that it began to melt the glacial ice surround her fractured soul. "I could not let them take her," Elara whispered, her voice fragile, breaking on every single syllable. "The council. They would have taken her from me." "They will never touch you," Torin vowed, his gold eyes burning with a fierce, protective agony. "No one will ever touch you again. The running is over. You are safe. You are found." He reached out with both hands, silently asking for permission. Elara finally dropped the heavy, invisible shield she had held for 6 agonizing years. She collapsed forward in the mud. Torin caught her instantly. He wrapped his massive, armored arms around her frail, shivering body, pulling her securely against his solid chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the intoxicating scent of winter snow and night, blooming hyacinth. Elara buried her face against the cold obsidian steel of his armor and wept. She wept for the years of starvation, for the terrifying nights in the abandoned barns, and for the sheer, overwhelmed relief of finally being able to rest. Torin held her fiercely, shielding both the mother and the child from the bitter wind. A king who had abandoned his throne to find his true crown in the mud. The transition from the squalid, freezing mud of the eastern border to the opulent, sunlit halls of the Ethelgard royal palace was a breathtaking resurrection. Alpha King Torin did not delegate the care of his newly discovered family to the palace servants. He carried Lyra in his own armored arms through the massive obsidian gates, with Elara walking safely at his side, tightly wrapped in his heavy black fur cloak. The healing of Elara's fractured spirit was a delicate, agonizingly slow process, but Torin proved to be a man of infinite, devoted patience. He immediately purged the remaining corrupt council members who had created the hostile environment that originally forced her to flee. He replaced her threadbare, oversized coat with breathtaking gowns of spun silver and midnight silk. He watched with a fiercely protective, overwhelmed warmth as Lyra, no longer forced to hide her brilliant amber eyes or painfully suppress her dominant royal instincts, ran freely through the gilded corridors, fully reclaiming the royal childhood that had been stolen from her. When the day of the royal coronation finally arrived, sprawling grand hall of the Ethelgard court was packed with every remaining lord, military commander, and noble in the empire. They stood in absolute, breathless silence as the heavy oak doors swung open. Elara walked down the pristine marble aisle, radiating a quiet, unbreakable steel. She was no longer a hunted, unaffiliated ghost hiding in the shadows of society. She was the absolute center of the empire. Alpha King Torin met her at the base of the Zace. He did not look at the massive assembly. He looked only at the woman who had protected his blood in the absolute dark, gently took her scarred hands in his, pressing a lingering, reverent kiss against her skin. Then, he turned to the court and placed the heavy, diamond-encrusted crown of the Luna upon her head, while Lyra stood proudly at his side, the undisputed heir to the throne. The entire Ethelgard pack dropped to their knees as one, their heads bowed in absolute submission to the unbreakable queen and the child who had called the king her father before he ever knew her name. What an absolute breathtaking journey of survival. primal instincts, and ultimate retribution. But the story leaves us with a terrifying, provocative question. Commander Vane was destroyed at the checkpoint. But what about the shadowy, corrupt council members in the capital who originally forced Elara to flee for her life? Should Alpha King Torin grant them a swift, painless execution? Or should he strip them of their wealth and force them to live as starving, unaffiliated wolves in the freezing eastern lowlands for exactly 6 years? Let me know your dark theories down in the comments below. If you are completely addicted to dark fantasy romance, fated mates, and fiercely protective alpha kings, make sure to hit that like button. Share this audiobook with your pack, and subscribe to Wolf Enigma. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss another thrilling chapter. Until next time, stay wild, and never underestimate a mother's protection.